Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the mightiest, smartest, and most feared orc in the galaxy. He is the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, and whenever he marches to war, the inhabitants of that world know that their doom comes beneath an unending tide of fanatical and brutal greenskins. In a previous episode of 40k Stories, we looked at Ghazghkull's origins, from humble beginnings on the planet of Uruk to the Third War of Armageddon. We pick up the tale as the Great War begins in earnest, including battles with the Imperium, Tyranids, and other orcs, to name but a few. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and this is 40k Stories. Before we begin, some brief backstory for those who have not seen the previous Ghazghkull episode, or for those who did not find that satisfactory. Ghazghkull was an orc trooper who sustained a massive cranial injury from a bolter round through his skull whilst fighting on the planet of Uruk. Mandok Grotznik saved the orc's life and replaced his cranium with one made of adamantium. From then on, Ghazghkull claimed he could hear the voices of the orc gods Gork and Mork in his head, and he rose to become warlord of Uruk before leading his war to the stars. Twice they have invaded Armageddon, a vital linchpin for the Imperium of Man and a possible gateway to Holy Terror itself. The first time, also known as the Second War for Armageddon, the first war was actually Angron, they were repulsed by the heroism of Commissar Yarrick, the mistakes of Ghazghkull, and the intervention of Astartes led by Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. The second invasion is still ongoing, and is the largest orc invasion seen in the Imperium's history. The size of this war has become difficult to imagine. Billions of lives have been lost so far. The very world has become a byword for war and destruction on a massive scale, where the mightiest war machines in the galaxy clashed and heroes died in droves. Orcs across the galaxy felt the vibrations of this war. Like moths to a flame, the most aggressive greenskins were being drawn to Armageddon, seeking fame and glory. But the Third War had spread beyond the planet, for the whole subsector was rife with orc raiders. Those worlds left vulnerable by the Imperial commitment to the Armageddon War were now burned. Rumours abounded that Ghazghkull had called the Ragnarok, the Great War, the final apocalyptic battle in which the orcs would prove their worth in the eyes of their violent primitive gods. The Imperium has been forced into a total war footing, feeding the meat grinder with entire planetary populations worth of troops. 1,000 light-year recruitment zone was established around Armageddon. Every Imperial world had their tithe of Imperial Guard tripled within that area, and their industry turned over solely to armament production. Even Imperial logisticians, themselves numbering more than a large army, could only estimate how many Imperial Guard had taken part, to say nothing of tracking the wealth of other forces. At last count, this included at least elements of 24 different Adeptus Astartes chapters, several orders of sororitas, and 6 Titan legions. Within the sector was also the better part of 17 separate Imperial fleets. Worse still, these figures were outdated by at least 1 Terran year, a time period in which the war had only grown larger, and so these figures are very out of date. The Imperium had always dreaded the unification of so many orc tribes, and now its worst fears were coming true. Already the wisest Imperial leaders faced the grim realization that likely the industry of Armageddon would soon be ruined beyond any repair. The war was now less about saving the planet, more about preserving the subsector and preventing the ever-swelling tides of orcs from growing larger. If the menace could not be contained, it would sweep outwards and threaten the heart of the Imperium itself. Holy Terror. But despite this, although it pained him to leave the largest battle he had ever seen, that any orc had ever seen, Ghazghkull knew he had work to do elsewhere. The Great War had to go on. Only the pull of destiny could drag the most dangerous orc warlord away from the battle that raged across Armageddon. But with the great green visions overwhelming him, Ghazghkull knew it was time to move on. That battle was self-sustaining and self-perpetuating, and he was needed to spread the whipples of war energy until they washed the galaxy in blood. Even as he waded through shellbursts and claimed marine helmets for his trophy rack, Ghazghkull could feel the pressure building behind his adamantium plate. He was about to have another vision from Gork and Mork, and if the pain in his skull was any indication, it was going to be a monumental one. It was too much to fight. Ghazghkull returned to his orbiting ship Killwrecker and at last gave in to the green flashes filling his patchwork mind. The voices of Gork and Mork had never been so strident, their bellowing still echoing in Ghazghkull's head. Yet no matter how many times he readjusted his thinking bits by beating them against the bulwark of the ship, Ghazghkull couldn't clear his head nor decipher what the guttural voices of the gods were saying to him. The pain of the visions was excruciating, and his good eye bulged as he roared in agony. Any other orc would consider a scrap like Armageddon a victory in itself, but they lacked ambition. Ghazghkull, blessed with his conqueror's visions, did not know exactly what he was looking for, and grasped only he would not find it on Armageddon. Trusting the voices would become clear in time, he ordered a handful of craft from the fleet that still surrounded Armageddon like vultures to gather around Uruk. Ghazghkull left the battle for Armageddon knowing his appointed lieutenants would command in his stead, as he had ordered. The greatest orc warlord of his era looked back upon the rapidly shrinking orb of Armageddon. He had just one regret. He doubted he would be back before his underlings conquered everything in his name. As the fleet gathered speed, Ghazghkull turned from the portal and looked about the bridge. On his orders, a herd of warp heads had been gathered. It was his hope the deranged orc mystics could aid his visions in a way similar to how their strange gifts seemed to help steer the best course once a space hulk entered the warp. Thus far, however, all the weird boys had done was annoy him. The warlord watched the drooling warp heads totter about, bumping into each other like boys in a beer stupor. In truth, this got Ghazghkull pretty annoyed. The old goth in him resolved troubles or ambiguities with a simple punch to the face. Unbeknownst to Ghazghkull, however, his departure from Armageddon did not go unmarked. Imperial Augustations observed the orc flotilla leaving the system, identifying the vessel known as Uruk, the capital ship favoured by Ghazghkull. High Command was notified and the pursuit was underway within days. Commissar Yarrick headed one fleet, and High Marshal Helbrecht of the Blood Templars led the other. They had allowed Ghazghkull to escape once, and it had cost them dearly, a mistake Yarrick vowed would not be repeated. Using a pincer approach, the faster, more efficient Imperial ships converged upon the Orc fleet several weeks after leaving Armageddon. Outnumbered in the midst of a barren space known as the Haunted Gulf, Ghazghkull realized he could not run. His foes would not be outrun. With nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, he ordered the fleet to steer directly into the midst of their enemies. By the weight of their broadsides, the Orc flotilla might be able to blast a path clear to freedom. Despite Yarrick warning that such a maneuver was not just possible but likely, the Imperial forces were still surprised by the unorthodox move. Several battlecruisers were left crippled, little more than drifting hulks. However, the return fire ripped the fleet apart, destroying ships one after another. Uruk was left listing badly, steering wrecked. As Yarrick and Helbrecht prepared to board the Orc vessel in order to personally ensure Ghazghkull's demise, Uruk was wreathed in a blaze of green energy. Uruk rocked back and forth and the land strikes penetrating its lower decks. The explosions blasted concussive forces through the ship, making the craft lurch violently and sending everybody sprawling, Ghazghkull included, his adamantium-clad skull denting the steel deck plates with a massive clang. Furious, he pushed out of the weird boy pile that had shifted on top of him, bellowing orders. It was then, his head still ringing, that an overwhelming force possessed Ghazghkull. An arcing crown of green lightning exploded outwards, washing everyone in a strange green light. The sudden explosion of energies was a spark that set off the warp heads, each convulsing in rhythmic spasms that grew in intensity. Engulfed in green flame, the crazed Orc-Psychers howled, as their skin sizzled and raw power burst forth from their eyes and gushed forth from their jaws. In voices like rolling thunder, the warp heads spoke as one, the same almighty roar of Gork and Mork that Ghazghkull had been hearing in his head. Now at last he understood what he had to do. The voice of the gods commanded Ghazghkull to unite the Orcs and make the galaxy echo to the sound of the Great War. The voice spoke again, saying that only unending battle would call the final Ragnarok, bringing forth Gork and Mork themselves into the physical realm. With their role in delivering their message done, the warp heads exploded in a vast outpouring of energy, drenching all those on the command deck with wet viscera and luminescent green energy. It was this surge observed by the Imperials as it rolled outwards, striking the enemy fleet like a tidal wave. With their ship systems ensnared by strange energy, Yarrick and Helbrecht could only watch as Uruk blinked once and was gone. The only evidence that had ever been there was a trail of floating debris where the ship had once been. Yarrick slumped, for he knew that Ghazghkull's escape only boded ill for the galaxy. Uruk was hurled into the warp, its course and destination unknown. Every greenskin on board endured an unsettling journey in which the echoes of that mighty voice still boomed in their minds. How long they travelled, or where they spun towards, none could say. Then, with a feeling similar to a punch in the gut, they halted, reappearing suddenly in real space. The Orcs staggered to the portholes, looking out and gasping in amazement. They were completely surrounded by spaceships of all sizes, but there could be no mistaking the make of such crude, rust bucket-like craft. Killwrecker had materialized precisely in the middle of an Orc fleet. Only recently Killwrecker had been imposing, its hulls protected by overlapping iron plate slabs and bristling with turrets, gun decks, and ordnance. However, after the Imperial fleet had punched a number of holes through it, internal explosions had done the rest. Ghazghkull's mechs began to swarm over the ship, repairing breaches to inner hull and patching up the pipes which vented gas into the corridors. The Orcs under Warlord Uruk the Slayer, for that was whose fleet they had appeared amidst, doubtless took Killwrecker for space junk, thinking that some scrapmongering death skulls or salvage crazed mechs were simply cutting up pieces of old wreckage. On board, Ghazghkull could have cared less about the hull repairs, instead ordering his mechs to fix the damaged teleporter, which was a device gifted to Ghazghkull by Big Mech Nazdrek during the War for Persina 4 between the Second and Third War for Armageddon. While they hustled about their tasks, the Prophet prepared his boarding parties. It was easy to pick out where the biggest Orc would be, for just above them in the center of the fleet was a monstrous space hulk. So much work had gone into it that it now looked like an Orc fortress floating through space. Knowing his advantage would be surprise, Ghazghkull trusted to luck and teleported blind. As if guided by the great green hands of Gork and Mork themselves, Ghazghkull and a mob of his biggest and baddest knobs, Ghazghkull's bully boys, appeared in a green flash in Warlord Urgok's command room. The action that followed was swift and bloody, the decks soon covered with the mangled corpses of the slain. Before they could recover from the shock, most of Urgok's bodyguard were dead, and Ghazghkull himself had pulled Uruk off his throne and beaten the living daylights out of him. So started a new war. Warlord Urgok's empire had grown so large that it took a few weeks for Ghazghkull to work his way through it. Most joined the Prophet willingly, but some stubborn cases needed a few messy examples before they too saw the wisdom of aligning themselves under Ghazghkull's banner. When he regained consciousness, Uruk himself became a leader within Ghazghkull's throng, which made recruiting the rest of his armies a lot easier. If the galaxy was going to be set ablaze with war energy, many more Orcs would be needed. Orcs are prolific and can be found throughout the entire galaxy. It's why they're such a pain for the Imperium. It would be the work of a million lifetimes to seek out every greenskin-held territory, to travel to the innumerable places where greenskins gathered in dominating numbers. Countless moons, planets, asteroid fields, space hulks drifting in the void. As Ghazghkull knew, such travel wasn't needed, because all Orcs are called by the power of the War. Urgok's wars have been drawing in a steady stream of greenskins, new recruits rising to the call of fighting, space travel, and the promise of even more. Under Ghazghkull, this flow became a cascading downpour as floods of Orcs rushed to join the fleet. Now all they needed was purpose. With agitated Orc hordes raring to go, Ghazghkull steered the fleet toward Orc territory. The remnants of his war-tuned brain had felt the distant ripples of green energies that came from distant Octarius. Rumors had come of a new leader, and it was Ghazghkull's intent to wrest the title Overfiend of Octarius for himself. Show this Orc what a real Overfiend was. However, what he found there was even better. Octarius had been Orc territory for many thousands of years. It wasn't as backwater a subsector as where Ghazghkull's home had been, and every so often a leader would wise up, call a war, and lead an invasion off to wreck some part of the galaxy. Indeed, the old warlord Gorsnik Magash had rushed off to join Ghazghkull in Golgotha, and currently was heading a vast force of Orcs on Armageddon in the Deadlands. Since Gorsnik had gone, a new leader had quickly risen to fill the power vacuum, claiming the title Overfiend of Octarius, a Deathskull warlord named Zog Steeltooth. Despite the copious use of blue war paint, which is considered lucky to the Orcs, the rule of Zog had thus far not been a lucky one. The Nids had returned, sweeping into the biomass-rich Orc territory and consuming entire planets as they advanced. The fight raged across the whole sector, its epicenter squarely targeted upon the central world of the territory, Octaria. The entire megacontinent of Octaria was a battlefield into which both sides poured their might. The Overfiend's Orcs, grown big and strong on their diet of war, had met their match. The ever-evolving spawn of High Fleet Leviathan were gaining the upper hand, showering the planet with reinforcements, sending yet further broods of killing beasts into the non-stop melee. Across Octaria, the Orcs were forced to take refuge in scrap iron fortifications. It seemed only a matter of time before the Tyranids collapsed each jury-rigged fortress. Then, Ghazghkull descended from those spore-ridden skies. At first, the Overfiend's Orcs thought the rocks blazing through were some kind of new enemy. All across Octaria they landed, smashing holes through the gargoyle-filled skies and ploughing into the hordes on the ground. It was not slime-covered chitin-plate Tyranids that emerged, however, but more orcs. They surged out, taking the fight to the Tyranids while the rocks opened up with heavy-caliber ordnance. The greenskins, behind their shabby defences, let loose volleys of cheers and hails of supporting fire of their own. Then came the heavy ground-shaking footfalls of incoming immense creatures. The hive mind had taken note of these new invaders. The response was frightening. Larger swarm creatures, hulking scythe-limbed horrors and gargant-sized beasts lumbered to oppose this new orc threat from the skies. The raucous chants of Octaria's orcs died in their throats. They knew these towering behemoths had been held in reserve, saved for the final death strike. When the orcs' defences had been breached, these monsters would have arrived, and now the newcomers would be shredded, for there was no hope for infantry in the open. To their surprise, the air flashed as teleporters began to bring more reinforcement. All across Octaria, the cratered rock landing sites blazed with unnatural lights. After each flash, more and more mobs appeared, and not just infantry. Arriving with guns chugging away, Gorkanauts and Stompers concentrated their firepower on the larger foes, while at their feet burner boys spread out. These sent blossoms of red fire leaping out to flash fry lesser creatures in droves. Amidst the mobs pouring forth, countless crude banners and totems could be seen, carried high by new troops or mounted atop clanking battle wagons. The orcs of Octaria saw the symbols, and they knew who had arrived. At Gargates, the overfiend's shanty capital, Uruk Thraka himself appeared via teleporter. He led the charge at the head of his bully boys as they crashed through the serpentine raveners that were beginning to undermine the first line of defense. To the greenskins that watched, this warlord in mega armor fought like Gork himself. He wove in and out of sight but was easy to find, an aura of green brutality seeming to surround him, and he clobbered each of his foes so hard that limbs, heads and claws flew in bloody arcs all around him. He moved like some elemental destructive force, a one-orc wave of destruction. His shooter spat death, and with every swipe, the power claw would slice multiple foes in half. Every motion, from his elbow backswing to the stomp of his feet, cracked the shell-like armor of the Tyranids and sent more to die, thrashing their death throes on the blood-strewn ground. And then, the unbelievable happened. The body-strewn landscape at Ghazghkull's feet buckled and bulged. And then Ghazghkull was gone. A Morlock had come. It burst from below, and the creature coiled about itself as it breached the surface. This was the largest such creature any assembled orc had seen, the deadliest spawn of its kind that ever slithered underground or was seen by the light of any sun. The screech of triumph bursting from the beast's gaping maw twisted metal, and made orcs miles away fall, covering their ears. However, even before its screech of victory was over, something had gone wrong. The Morlock heaved, flopping its mass so that it seemed the world itself was trembling. Then the beast quivered, writhed with convulsions, twisting its mighty coils in arcing loops. An unnatural bulge formed in its midsection, and out thrust a power claw, amidst geysers of gore and slime-covered entrails. Shooter blasts widened the hull, and out stepped Ghazghkull from the very belly of the beast. The mightiest of orc warlords roared his victory, a rallying cry to greenskins and a challenge to every other living creature. After that, the orcs were unstoppable. Chanting their warlord's name, the greenskins of Ghazghkull went on a rampage, hacking, shooting and slaying in a berserk frenzy. From behind scrap-iron walls, the Octarian orcs burst forth to join in. Even Zog, the overfiend of Octarius, was chanting the name Ghazghkull as he gunned down the living wall of Tyranids that attempted to stay the onslaught. A great butchery began, and it did not stop until Octaria was free of the creatures of High Fleet Leviathan. For a brief time, Octaria was scoured clean of Tyranids. After the display of might they had witnessed, all of Zog's lot joined Ghazghkull. More and more orcs from many light years away were arriving daily. This was good news, as reports brought back by Ghazghkull's fleet told of an enormous cloud of bioships already en route. Somehow High Fleet Leviathan had sensed the gathering riches of biomass centered on Octaria, and the High Fleet is quick to learn from its mistakes. Correspondingly, it sent forth yet more of its tendrils toward that sector, hive ships already bulging with weapon beasts ready to assault. Though Ghazghkull had little time to prepare, he had made the most of it. Mechs wielded iron-plated walls back into position or patched acid-eaten holes. Others cited new cannons and anti-aircraft weapons, better integrating the rocks into the overall defense. Under the keen eyes of Archimedes, Ghazghkull's chief mech, a few snazzy upgrades from teleporter pads to pulsar rockets would give the intergalactic aliens something new to chew on. If anything, this fight looked to be even bigger than the one on Armageddon. Already the skies began to darken as a huge, brooding shadow covered the stars above. Looking up, Ghazghkull bared his fang-like teeth in as close to a grin as he could manage. This war was only getting started. Since his departure from Armageddon, the visions that temporarily filled Ghazghkull's surgically repaired brain have become more frequent. Some of these were strong convulsions that toppled him over, causing him to writhe in agony. Other visions were less obtrusive, and these Ghazghkull was actually getting some control over. They showed him snippets of the action on Armageddon. Ghazghkull saw Zagboss Skargrim tearing it up on his warbike, or watched Commandant Clank lead his boys to another victory. Even in the visions, the sight of orcs marching in rows like human troops was really rather infuriating, but he couldn't argue with the Bloodaxe Warlord's battle record. Ghazghkull knew these weren't dreams. He was actually watching real events unfold. Despite the vast distance, sometimes, when he issued commands or tactical advice during particularly gripping visions, Ghazghkull could have sworn that his voice was carried and that his subordinates heard his every bellow. This thought amused him. He heeded the voices in his head, and his lieutenants, British, were likely tormented. As for Ghazghkull's own voices, they were already warning him. Once the battle on Octaria got going, it would be time to leave once again, because he had a destiny to meet. He only needed 3 or 4 more sectors raging with battle to swell the orc population to critical mass. In his visions, Ghazghkull was stomping across the galaxy, his strides spanning stars beyond count, and each of his mighty footprints were swathes of planets aflame with war. Armageddon, Octaria. He was already anxious for the next ones. And there you have it, the tale of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. So far. Time will tell whether the war on Octaria will go the way of Armageddon, whether the Tyranids can consume the giant orc mass, or whether they will be stomped out, like so many before them. Will Ghazghkull be able to complete the visions of Gork and Mork, create the ultimate Ragnarok, and drown the galaxy in green? None know for sure, but we know he will not be long on Octaria before he's back, warmongering in another sector, setting it aflame with the fires of conflict and the battle cries of orcs. Even if he were to fail, it is my theory that another warlord will eventually rise up, take his place, and continue his great work in the name of Gork and Mork. So thank you very much for watching today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful and informative. Make sure to let me know your thoughts on Ghazghkull's story in the comments below, and let me know what future stories you'd like me to tell. As for me, this has been a particular joy. Ghazghkull is the boss for my army, my all-time favourite, my first army, and so telling his story has been an absolute pleasure. So, I'll hopefully see you all in the next 40k Stories video, whenever that may be. Let me know what you want me to do. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again.